Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Keele University, in particular for those of you who don't come so often. My name's Trevor Macmillan. I have the great privilege of being the Vice-Chancellor here at Keele. And part of that privilege really is to present our inaugural lecturers and the season that we do every year for our new professors. But before I get into some of the details around Allanah, can I just give you a special welcome this evening through the weather conditions that we have. I have to say, we did get a message to Allanah at lunchtime today saying, do you want to pull the plug? There might not be much of an audience, that we can postpone it and do it later. But I have to say that the immediate response was, no, I've got at least 4 family members travelling up from Devon. We're not going to put them back. So a great welcome to all of you, but in particular to the family members who have arrived here this evening. To have family support on an occasion like this is really a big bonus for our new professors. This series really is fantastic for the universities. I say it all the time that actually it gives us a chance to show off the talents that we have in the university, but it also gives us an opportunity to really show off the sheer breadth of what we do in terms of the research here at Keele. And on many occasions allows us to show off how actually we can join up some of the great research we do in different parts of the university to really address some of the issues that require input from a range of different disciplines. And I think this evening is one such occasion that I'm certainly looking forward to as we go through. I'll have to forgive me, I'm going to have to hold this up. I've just got some new glasses today and I haven't quite got used to them. Allanah actually graduated from Keele in 1991. Dual honours, first class honours in English and history. And while she was here, actually won the Wedgwood Dissertation Prize. She went from here to Oxford and studied for her DPhil. And actually, I'm not sure who's written these notes for me, but it actually comments that she wrote up her DPhil within 3 years, which for some of you who haven't written a PhD or a DPhil, that might sound fairly trivial, but actually these days, actually I have to say it's quite an achievement. The topic of that actually was an experience of urban poverty, and that actually led to the publication of her thesis a few years later. After that, she actually came back to Keele in 1995 as a lecturer in history, but importantly, and I think reflecting in some of the research that she's continued to do, actually spending half her time as an assistant editor on the multi-county Victoria County History Project. In the background, having her family as she came through, which is always, I think, a tough period in an academic's life, but actually, also importantly around that time, really embedding herself in the setting up of a medical school here at Keele. And that link between medicine and humanities, I think, is very, very important. And Allanah has been not just an important advisor on how the humanities should feed into medical education, but indeed important in the delivery of those in terms of the supervision of some of the special study modules for many of the students. She does do an awful lot of work around local history, local people, and I suspect that some of you in the audience are here because of those connections that Allanah has quite extensively in this part of the world with various history organisations. She published a major book on and what that says about how doctors failed between 1780 and 1890, and again that link into medicine. And one of the highlights in the last few months has actually been the award of a grant with a colleague in the University of Sussex from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which actually is for in excess of £700,000, which within the HRC, I can assure you, is a major achievement. So that is enough from me. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Allanah Tompkins to deliver her inaugural lecture, which is The Workhouse, a Victorian Institution Through Working Class Eyes.
thank you for coming on this particularly snowy evening. I know everybody's had to struggle, whether it's on foot or by car, so thank you very much for making it this evening. I'm particularly glad to be giving this lecture to you, but also in this room. I first came to Keele in February 1987, and if memory serves, and the lecture I'm going to give may demonstrate that memory doesn't serve, but if memory serves, I was sitting somewhere along that side of the room. So it's wonderful to be back in this particular space to give this lecture. Now, as Trevor's talk indicated, I've been working on workhouses for a long time. I started off my undergraduate dissertation in history, looking at the Exeter Corporation of the Poor, and that was back in 1991. So on and off, I've been looking at workhouses for 26 years. So this is a subject that's very close to my heart, even though I have spent a lot of time looking at medicine and medical practitioners as well. So what I want to do today is to, I hope, very briefly cover some of the basic components of the history of the post-1834 workhouse and its satellite institutions. I don't want to spend too long on that, so I hope it won't take me very long to get through. And the clock is nice and visible to me up there, so I should be able to keep myself to time. What I really want to do is to spend most of the time I have to speak talking about the voices of working class autobiographers when they're talking about the workhouse or one of the workhouse institutions. So I want to talk about the sort of voices they adopt, the models they use to talk about these very difficult, problematic institutions. And then I want to conclude by looking at two particular case studies. The workhouse had a number of offshoots, one of which was called the district school. That is to say, a kind of a school, a residential institution which enabled lots of different workhouses to send their children to the one place and to educate them and then provide them with sort of employment placements. And I've got two sort of quite rich examples of people who are autobiographers who wrote about their time in district schools, and I want to be able to talk, give myself the time to talk a little bit about them. So, first of all, the post-1834 workhouse. Workhouses existed in England from 1696, so there were lots of institutions in existence before 1834. They were places which took in people who were too poor to make ends meet. They might be designed to set people to work in exchange for welfare, but they didn't always set people to work, particularly up to 1834, because parishes and towns discovered quite quickly that it's quite difficult to find a form of work that you can set people on that enables them to do something meaningful, to undertake some sort of activity, but which doesn't require a lot of training. So the pre-1834 workhouses were much more variable in terms of the sort of work they might have put people on, the extent to which they might have divided up men from women, young from old, and the extent to which they might have been punitive. Because the 1834 workhouse, that is to say, the workhouses that were built after this act was passed, was supposed to be punitive. They were supposed to be less eligible or present life in a form that was less eligible than life outside of the workhouse. So in other words, if you went into a workhouse, you were supposed to be less well fed, less well housed than anything that you could afford if you were independent and were living under your own steam. Unfortunately for the Poor Law Commission, they quickly discovered that if you feed people less well inside the workhouse than they were able to afford outside, you were effectively starving people to death. So the workhouse diet quickly was revised so that it wasn't quite so less eligible. But these were institutions which were built, there was a mass of building took place between 1834 and 1845-ish. These were large institutions, so whereas pre-1834 workhouses might have housed 40 to 80 people, these were institutions that housed 200 to 400 people, more typically. They were supposed to separate people of different groups, so they were supposed to put a wedge between and ensure people didn't meet. Men and women were on different sides of the house. Children were removed from parents and put in a separate part of the workhouse. And because of this enormous scale of building, after 1834. Only a generation after the law was passed, there were a very great number of institutions taking people in. So there was something like 125,000 people as inmates in workhouses and their allied institutions by 1861. So a generation after the law, there's 125,000 people. Those aren't staff. Those are inmates. And by the time the poor law ended, and depending on what sort of historian you are, you might say it ended in 1929 with public assistance, or you might say it ended with the founding of the NHS in the 1940s. But by the time it ended, there were at least another 80 or 90 institutions added to those workhouses. And they tended to be either infirmaries, so separate site infirmaries where people could obtain health care without having to be part of the formal workhouse system. They might be cottage homes, which were smaller scale houses, which were designed to accommodate children, or they might be district schools. So these relatively few but large-scale schools for children who would otherwise have been in a workhouse. So we're talking about an institution with a lot of space in it during the Victorian period. There's a lot of beds, a lot of room in these institutions. They're not always full to the brim, but they do exist in some numbers. It has to be said that the ability of working class autobiographies to achieve coverage of these institutions it's not viable. Working class autobiographies, it's something of a Keel habit, really, to study working class autobiographies. My former colleague here, David Vincent, specialised in and indeed helped to produce a publication of a list of working class autobiographies that he tracked down with his PhD supervisor, John Burnett, and David Mayle. And between them, they found something like 2,500 working class autobiographies written somewhere between 1790 and 1940. So there's quite a few of these texts out there, whether they're published or they're handwritten, they exist. But the number of those texts which relate to workhouses is very few. So you have something like 700 institutions that might house paupers in the Victorian period, and possibly only 70 or 80 working class autobiographies that really mention them in any detail, and very many fewer, so perhaps only 24 of these things, which talk about workhouses or infirmaries or vagrancy wards or district schools as from the point of view of the person who's admitted, the inmate, somebody who was taken into one of those institutions or who sought admission to one of those institutions because they had to. So there's no real scope for fair coverage because there are many, many places and very few of these autobiographies that touch on these things. But what the autobiography gives you the chance to do is to consider the way the institution, whether it is a workhouse or whether it's a school, how it fits into the life course of an individual person. Because you can look at the records of workhouses, and I've looked at lots of them, and they give you details about that particular institution, or they give you, you might, in the case of a scandal, have a lot of information in the press about a place at a particular point in time. But what you don't so often get, or you can't get anywhere else other than an autobiography, is an image of the way that this institution fits into a life and how people accommodate it within their life story that they're trying to tell. So while there are relatively few of these things, I have been trying to work with them to see what they will yield in terms of telling the story of Victorian institutions, poor law institutions, and the working class inmates who sort of find themselves in them or found themselves in them. There are a couple of things I need to say about those 24 or so autobiographies that I'm really working with. One of them is that the vast majority of them are written by people who were admitted to an institution as a child and write up their experience in adulthood. Now, I don't think I've ever come across anyone who had the scope and idea of writing up their experience as a child when they were a child. But this means that we're talking about people who are remembering the workhouse, who are looking back and seeing it in the course. They have the opportunity to exercise hindsight in other words. So they fit it into the life that they're telling it's in a particular place in life where some time has elapsed. Sometimes it's only a decade, sometimes it might be 60 years, but time has elapsed since they were in that institution and since they left. Another feature of these autobiographies is that in addition to the presence of the institution, very many of these people also talk about their families, so their birth family, because if someone has to be admitted to an institution like a workhouse, there has probably been an issue with their family. It might be, doesn't mean that there's necessarily any blame attached. It might be that a child is orphaned, and that therefore they are the most suitable placement in the Victorian sort of schema is to place them in a workhouse. But there is usually some sort of balance or imbalance in terms of what families can offer and are prepared to offer and what institutions are available, which means that the institution is inevitably placed in somebody's life course in relation to family, parents and siblings particularly. So one of the things that you can, the forms of context that you can reliably thread out from these autobiographies and place alongside the information about institutions is the way that their family shapes up. Who were their parents? What did their siblings do? What were their experience? And how did they evaluate their own experience in relation to that of their parents and siblings? The final thing that I think you can do with these autobiographies is to say, okay, well, these are very poignant texts, and they are kind of they're an entity, they are a whole unto themselves. But there's also the historical record aside from that. So once you've got an autobiography and you know who the writer is, and you know what institution they're talking about, you can start to hook in to their story, things that you can retrieve from institutional records, from the census, from baptism and burial records, from bankruptcy records. You can find a way to, not because I just want to sort of see whether they're fibbing, but because it enables you to see how they are placing this institution in relation to all the other experiences which you can see that they had from newspaper reports or from census entries. So one of the key things I'm doing with the district school children that I'll be talking about at the end is not only to tell part of their story, but also to relate it to what you can find out from other sources. So I hope I've been I can now get on to what I really want to talk about, which is the voices that come up in these autobiographies. So the autobiographies that exist, these 24 texts that I can work from that meaningfully unpack something of what it was like to be an inmate in one of these institutions. The most obvious off-the-peg, if you like, choice for a voice or a model to adopt is that of Oliver Twist. So Oliver Twist is published as a novel by Dickens in 1837-8, and everybody knows about it. People don't have to be literate to know about it. The image of the little boy asking for more becomes one of the most iconic moments in 19th century literature, although I know there's at least one specialist in the room who might want to wave their hand and say, no, you're wrong. But it becomes a moment which lots of people who haven't read the book and perhaps can't read are aware of, which means that everybody who writes an autobiography incorporating a workhouse where they were as a child has of necessity to grapple with Oliver, because you can't ignore it. It's there, whether you like it or not. There is this image of a child who is born in a workhouse, who is sent out of it to what's called a baby farmer, somebody where the children, they survive by accident almost in this house because they're so maltreated and malnourished, brought back into the workhouse as an older child, and then of course asks for more and is packed off as an apprentice. So people have to engage with Oliver, and they do, because lots of these, I would say a good 2/3 of these sort of 24 or so autobiographies mention Oliver in one way or another. They might do it directly, or they might do it indirectly, but they refer to, for example, Mr. Bumble, and refer to the phenomenon of Bumbledom, whereby Mr. Bumble represents everything that is bad about the new poor law, or they might do it by saying, well, they might talk about the disgusting food in the workhouse and therefore reference Oliver and his sort of very challenging relationship with workhouse food. And there is, of course, a local example of this. So not every county has an autobiography that talks about workhouses, but North Staffordshire does have one in the form of Charles Shaw. So Charles Shaw was a little boy of about 10. He went into the Woolstanton and Burslem workhouse as in about 1844, I think, thereabouts. And he wrote about the experience 60 years later, right at the end of the 19th century. And I was checking again today, I can't see that he uses the words Dickens, Bumble or Twist, but he's clearly referencing the phenomenon of kind of the oppression of hunger in one of these institutions. He talks about the food being so gristly, for example, that it would break a tiger's teeth to try and eat this food. So this is food which no one in their right minds would ask for more of this dish. So there's something we have to be aware of, I think. The pervasive presence of Oliver is something we need to take into account when we sort of notice the phenomenon of it coming out through these autobiographies. Because research on modern trauma, Dickens is a kind of researcher on trauma in a sense, but modern researchers on trauma, 20th and 21st century researchers on trauma would say, when there is a very public narrative related to a particular sort of trauma, you will find that individuals' narratives start to coalesce with that general public story. So, in other words, there's been research in relation to First World War. So this is chiefly to do with survivors of military events, First World War participants, Vietnam War participants, Falklands War participants. When there is a very public story published in relation to what it is like to participate in one of those conflicts, individual stories which then come along subsequently do tend to sort of start to veer quite closely towards the public narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that those people are lying or consciously doing anything in relation to this very sort of dominant story. What it might mean is that people understand that their hearers or listeners or readers have a story they expect to read, or it might mean that the interplay between their own experience and this public narrative means that they see themselves aligned with this sort of stereotype story. And it may well be that the Oliver Twist story, that of a child in a workhouse being very hungry and wanting more food and not getting more food, that may well align with a lot of people's experience. But I think we do have to be aware that there is a strong possibility that Oliver might have cornered the market, if you like, in relation to what people can say about workhouses, because that story is so familiar, so well known, so pervasive, that it's quite difficult to pull away from. Having said that, the second point on my PowerPoint is anti-Oliver, because there are one or two people who explicitly say it wasn't like that. And one of them is a man called Samuel Shaw, so another Shaw. He was somebody who had experience of lots of these institutions, in fact. He was admitted to the Birmingham workhouse with his sister, and then they both went to one of the cottage homes, so one of these slightly more sort of domestic set-up arrangements for children, and then they both suffered from eye infections. The sort of very severe conjunctivitis was quite common, obviously very contagious and quite common in these places. So they both went to the infirmary, and he describes this experience as very pleasant, and he's not being sarcastic. He says these were very pleasant surroundings. When we left the infirmary, we felt like we'd been very well taken care of. And you read this this account, and you think, the first instinct is to think, what's your angle? Why are you lying? And then you start to think, well, maybe it's not. Maybe there's a political reason why this person wants to present the institutions they went into as being particularly, as not that bad. I mean, and sure, Samuel Shaw certainly knew about Dickens, because he refers to writers of immortal fame, meaning Dickens, and he says, I don't remember asking for more. So he's explicitly referencing Oliver. So what's going on? And David Vincent et al., when they wrote a brief description of Samuel Shaw's autobiography, said, well, he was, of course, as an adult, a fervent anti-socialist. So I was thinking, okay, how does this political viewpoint, so a passionate, working-class, conservative voter, and I don't just mean a passive voter, I mean somebody who went and stood on street corners and spoke in public to try to secure more working-class voters for the Conservative Party. Why would this make him feel that he had to talk up the workhouse? Is that what's going on? Possibly. It could be that because of the way he interpreted the working class lot, he clearly saw his own best interests aligned with the Conservative Party. Maybe he saw an institution which you went into voluntarily as so much better than one that you went into under compulsion. And he had a point of comparison, because after he came out of the workhouse as a slightly, not as an older child, not so much as an adolescent, he was forcibly placed in an industrial school, which he described as a children's prison. So in other words, he has this set of comparisons in his own mind between the treatment he had as a child in the Birmingham workhouse and in the industrial school, which is, as it happened in London, in a place called Felton, which is now perhaps more known for its borstal, which still exists. So is there a curious sort of interplay of events going on here between his later political views and the fact that he had something which explicitly made what he experienced in the workhouse sort of pale in comparison to the things that he suffered in industrial school? I don't have the answer to that, but there's certainly a very interesting set of possibilities for Sam Shaw. There's also, of course, under the anti-Oliver, I ought to mention here, there perhaps ought to be another little kind of another entry here, was just an additional tangent. The idea, it's not so much anti-Oliver, it's more that the workhouse actually has such a small bit part in somebody's much larger family drama that it really doesn't, it's not that significant compared to what else was going on in their lives. So, for example, there's an autobiography called Pat OMara. He was born in 1901, and as a small child he went into the Liverpool Brownlow Street workhouse for a fairly short period of time, so sort of 2 or 3 weeks. And he just skates over it. And you think, well, is that because you're just a very small child and you don't really remember it, or, you know, what's going on? But actually, there, I think it is very explicitly the case that the workhouse pales in comparison to what he experiences in his home life. Because Pat O'Mara and his slightly older sister lived in a house that was continually riven by domestic violence. So he and his older sister Alice, on a weekly and sometimes daily basis, had to pull their parents apart because their father would beat their mother in a drunken rage every week at least. And so there'd be the two children, the little girl saying to the mother, don't rise to it, you know, don't do anything to make him cross. The little boy keeping his father on the other side of the room saying, don't do it, she's not worth it dirtying your knuckles for. And he describes at one stage he uses the phrase, the hellhole that we called home. So it is possible that the workhouse pales into insignificance in comparison to the other sort of deprivations and harshnesses that people suffered in their own houses or families. There's another, perhaps the next most important after Oliver, is the self-improvement narrative. In other words, the story where somebody goes into the workhouse or one of its institutions as a child, comes out, makes good. So by their own independence, they pull themselves up and they become solvent, dependent, and then they were able to write about it as something, a kind of a nadir from which they were able to rise. And there's my favourite example of this sort of story is that of a man called John Castle. He went into the workhouse in Leighton Buzzard in the late 1830s, so this is relatively early on in the New Poor Law. He went in there with his brother and sister-in-law. He was only 17, his brother was slightly older. And after a short stay, he had a falling out with one of the workhouse officials, and they said, right, we're going to kick you out. Now, this was technically not allowed. If somebody had a legal settlement in a union, which is a group of parishes which sent their poor people to a workhouse, that workhouse had to accommodate those people if they wanted to be there. And so this, strictly speaking, was contravening the letter of the law. But they gave him 4 shillings, pushed him out the door and said, go for a soldier. And he writes this in a very affecting terms, partly, of course, because he's being thrown out of the institution of last resort, and partly because he's being forcibly separated from his brother and sister-in-law. And he wept. He wept to be sent out of the workhouse. It's a desperately affecting scene. And this is not from a young man with no family outside of the workhouse. In fact, the first thing he does is walk to his mother's house. His mother lives with by then a stepfather, and weeps some more. He's desperately unhappy. But then he goes to London, he gets a job, he makes good. And you might think, okay, so that you would talk about the workhouse as a place that from which you recovered, you pulled yourself up, and you went on to much greater things, which he certainly did in terms of solvency. According to his autobiography, he never went back into that sort of dependency. But John Castle did something very interesting at that point when he's got out of the work, because he's decisively out. It's 18 months, 2 years later. He's not going to be going back in. But he walks back to Leighton Buzzard, and he goes back for a social visit. So he knocks on the door of the workhouse, rings the bell rather. The porter opens the door. He says, "Don't you know me, Culverhouse?" The porter is somebody who was expecting presumably some kind of inspector or some official visitor, and there he is, this lad who was kicked out, who's on his, this is on his uppers, and now he's come back as a visitor, and he goes round the male wards of the workhouse. He hands out a few pennies to the male inmates he meets, and he goes again. In other words, he positions himself in the same place as those people who were workhouse benefactors, the kind of people who might say, "Oh, I've got a crate of oranges, I'll give it to the workhouse poor at Christmas." He positions himself as a philanthropist. But in doing so, he reincorporates the workhouse experience back into his life history. He doesn't reject it in any sense. He actually goes back and re-embraces it, if you like, by visiting it in, I think the phrase he uses, in a different character to the one with which I left. So the Oliver story and the self-improvement story can fit together quite well for some people's purposes. So it's not the case that people necessarily just have one voice. There could be more than one voice. I've put up there the picaresque. This is a type of voice. I don't know whether I'm going to leave this bit in the article I write of this lecture, in the sense that I'm not confident it's there often enough to really be flagged up. But in the case of some usually adult males who experience life in the workhouse vagrant ward. So in other words, they're not admitted to the workhouse proper. They're not going to be there for weeks at a time. They're just going to be there for a night or two before they move on somewhere else. There's one or two stories where people describe this in very humorous sort of terms. This is like a sort of 18th century story where things happen to you, and you just sort of, you are the sort of rather wry witness to these events occurring. And there are one or two of those, but I don't know that they're that significant, so I might cut those. One I'm going to keep in, even though there's only one example, is the sardonic expose, and that's the book that's represented here visually. So the sardonic expose is picking up on a different tradition to that of Dickens. So Dickens establishes a literary tradition for the way you talk about workhouses through Oliver Twist. There's a different journalistic tradition founded by a man called James Greenwood. James Greenwood was a middle-class writer. He wrote children's stories and whatnot. And his brother was the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. And his brother twisted his arm and said, "Look, I will give you this money if you will go into the workhouse just for a night, just dress up as a vagrant for one night, and then come out and write something for my paper to tell, so as a kind of scandal what happens in these workhouses." So James Greenwood allowed his arm to be twisted. He was paid very handsomely. He dressed up in a vagrant garb, was dropped off at the Lambeth workhouse by his brother in this carriage and four. You can kind of see the scene. He got admitted to the vagrancy ward, and his experience was written up over, I think, 4 nights in January 1866. And the Pall Mall Gazette it flew off the shelves. People were utterly immersed in the filth, the sordid horror of it all, the way that James Greenwood wrote it up. So there is this alternative sort of tradition in which you could write up a workhouse experience. And this is the only one I've come across that tries that, but this is from somebody who is not a vagrant. This is somebody who is admitted to a workhouse and as a permanent member of the resident poor, and decides to write a book as his way out. So the way he tells it in this book is that I have to get out of this place. How can I do that? I can do that by writing my story and selling it to a publisher. So sure enough, he writes it up. He refers to a friend who supplied me with paper and ink. I'm very interested about this friend, but I'm never going to be able to find out who they were. And then he writes up the experience, sells the book to a publisher, and gets out. Now this book is the most difficult to handle I think I've got, in the sense that it's written anonymously. It's hardly an autobiography because you get almost no family or detail at all. But what's fascinating, I think, is it starts off as an expose, a kind of journalistic exercise at more length. And what it becomes is more of an autobiography, almost in spite of the author. He kind of can't keep himself away from betraying his own feelings about things. So he starts off the book describing essentially all the paupers as people on the make, and all of the workhouse officials as fools, people who are the dupes of these scheming paupers. However, he can't keep it up, because as you go through the story, what you find is that he starts to, you see flashes of sympathy for certain groups of people, and even the staff and the Board of Guardians, that's to say the people who are elected to help run the workhouse. He's got sympathy for them as well. And so you get these kind of very mixed messages by the end of the book. This is a book, as I say, which is published anonymously. The writer has been tracked down, in fact, by the editor of this modern edition. He was a man called John Rutherford, who went into the Poplar Workhouse in London in 1865 and spent about 5 months there. And we can't find out anything else out about him. John Rutherford is too common a name for me to be able to track him down with any certainty anywhere else. But we do know his age, which is 61. And suddenly, when you know his age is 61, suddenly lots of things fall into place about this narrative, because he's got one of the groups he's got a lot of sympathy for is the older men. So he describes some unions don't set the poor old men to picking oakum, which is a really rotten job because it roughs up your fingers. But they do here. And it's also useful to know that which workhouse he went to. He went to the Poplar Workhouse in London. Now, Poplar is a very particular union, which gave rise to its own particular political response to the new poor law in the form of Poplarism. In other words, the minute that these boards of guardians, this group of elected people who run a workhouse, the minute that working class people could be elected as boards of guardians, which was in 1894, Poplar was one of the first places to have really concerted attempts to get working class candidates elected to those boards of guardians. And then people like Will Crooks and George Lansbury, later MPs and leading lights in the Labour Party, then work the system in favour of the poor inhabitants of the workhouse instead of in favour of the ratepayers. So he just so happens that John Rutherford was doing an expose of a very particular workhouse, which actually inspires its own whole political response. I don't think we can assume that Poplar was all that, perhaps nowhere's typical, but Poplar is a very particular place. So I've given you some idea about the different voices that people adopt. What I want to do now in the last sort of 10, 15 minutes, hopefully not too much longer, is to talk about the ways that two particular memoirs talk about district schools. District schools were the bright idea of a man called Edward Tufnell. He was very keen on the idea of sparing the pauper children from the pauper taint. So the idea was that the workhouse was supposed to be punitive, but let's take children out of that atmosphere, let's put them somewhere more nourishing, somewhere where they will get an education, where they can be sent out into the world to obtain work and be independent. So these were a bright idea of an 1830s educational theorist. They were very expensive, so very few got built. There were only, I think the first one, there was an Enabling Act of 1848, and there were 10 built before 1880, so there weren't masses of them, and they were mostly clustered in London, where perhaps it made more sense. You've got lots of densely populated places that could all send their children from their workhouses to sort of central schools. The idea of sparing the children the pauper taint seems to me, in hindsight, wildly optimistic, given that the schools were also run by the Poor Law Board and later the Local Government Board, so the same authority that ran the workhouses. They were run by the same staff, and they were run on the same lines. So the chances of the likelihood of being able to escape the pauper taint seem to me relatively slim. But they have the autobiographies that talk about district schools as a little group, because oddly enough, they are quite well represented amongst these autobiographies. There's 5 or 6 where people reflect on their time in district schools later in life. They have already been used by at least one historian to say, well, these were places where the food was dull and probably not enough, the curriculum was dire, there was corporal punishment, so people were beaten regularly. These were dreadful, dreadful places. And what I want to do now is to give you 2 examples of those stories, the most detailed of the most detailed 2 district school stories. one of which strongly endorses that view and one of which seriously problematises it. So Frank Stone was born in 1860, died 1939. He was the child of a London couple. They had a number of children. I think they had about 5 children, 3 of whom lived, so he had 2 older brothers. And his father had a series of financial misfortunes. He went into the Whitecross Street debtors' prison. The father was made bankrupt, and their fortunes just got worse and worse until the point where the whole family had to be entered into the workhouse. He wrote under a thin pseudonym. So Frank Stone wrote the book Ditcher's Row under the name Frank Steele. And I have to say it was one of the rare sort of punching the air moments of my career when I worked out what the pseudonym was, because as I sought Frank Steele, I could not find him anywhere. I couldn't make it work with the pattern of the brothers and the parents and whatnot. And when I cracked it, and incidentally I confirmed it's not just kind of a good guess, it is actually Frank Stone, because I went back to the publisher's correspondence and proved that it was him. It was one of those rare moments where you actually find something out, which is quite an unusual moment. Now, his story of the district school, he went in aged 8. He went in with his slightly older brother, Henry, who's incidentally, if you ever get hold of one of the very rare surviving copies of this book, he calls his brother Henry, he calls him Reggie in the book. He experienced something so much worse than Oliver, because he was admitted to the younger boys' ward while his brother was admitted to the older boys' ward. And he didn't appreciate the significance of this as they went through the door, but this meant that his brother, Henry, was under the control of, outside of school hours, he was under the care of a man called, who Frank calls Easygoing Jerry. In other words, this was a male sort of warder, somebody who was a fairly amiable character. Frank was under the care, I use that in inverted commas, of a woman he calls in his memoir Kate. Now, I've looked at the records of the school, so I know this was Kate McKenzie. She was aged 22 when he was admitted to the school, and if his recollections are correct, she was verging on psychopathy, because she beat the children in her care every day with her hands or with wooden paddles, and she was particularly vicious when they were ill. So if they developed ophthalmia, which is this severe conjunctivitis, or if they developed chilblains on their hands or feet, she took to treating this illness, particularly the chilblains, by placing their hands and feet very close to the fire to try to burn them out. Now, she did this allegedly, she alleged she did it partly because she assumed that the kids wanted to get into the workhouse, the district school infirmary and get away from her by rubbing their eyes and inducing a kind of form of conjunctivitis. And so she was punishing them for bringing it on. Well, that was her narrative. She was, when you look at the records of the school, she was something that Frank perhaps couldn't appreciate at the time. There was a burgeoning national scandal, the extent to which children were obtaining these eye infections in places like district schools. So she could have been guilty of an extremely maladaptive response to workplace stress. But she was also she was backed up by the district school doctor, who said the children give themselves ophthalmia by rubbing their eyes. So in other words, she was in a sense not acting on her own. She was also acting completely illegally, in the sense that the only chastisement that was supposed to be visited upon children in district schools was by the schoolmaster, and it was supposed to be applied 2 hours or more after the offence had occurred. So in other words, there was supposed to be a cooling down of everybody, calming down of after whatever misdemeanour had occurred, and then it could be beating. Corporal punishment was a feature of these schools, but it was with the prescribed instrument. Certainly not with the kind of wooden paddles that she chose to use, not just the flat of the paddle, but the sharp side of it, because Frank describes seeing and receiving these blows himself. Now, he describes his time in the district school, not just of having deprived him with food, which it did, not just exacting violence upon him, but as depressing him for the whole of the rest of his life. So towards the end of his narrative, he writes, "As I look back over my life, what do I see down all the vista of years but long, drab stretches of discouragement and disappointment, of hopeless or but half hopeful because always cramped and hindered endeavour, of heartbreaking hope deferred, of painful groping in a dim and tangled ways of sordidness and deprivation, broken rather than varied or relieved by a few fleeting gleams of light, little incidents of hope and promise that seldom if ever brighten to anything after all. Just as one was thinking, here comes the sun at last. The cheering rift closed in and all was overcast again. So that was at the end of his life. He felt, and it's psychologically consonant with the abuse he suffered, that he would never be able to escape the desperate sense of sort of depression and lack of self-worth that this treatment under Kate's auspices sort of invoked. That's not to say that his time at the school was completely unvaried. When he got a bit older, he joined his brother in the older group under the care of easygoing Jerry. Things got a lot better. He discovered he had a good singing voice, and when he left school, he left school as he describes it saying, boys have their fallings out, but it was much better once I'd escaped Kate's clutches. But he never recovered, according to his own description, from this treatment he had as a child, which, my final point there, points up the importance perhaps of the variability of staff behaviour. Not all the staff at this district school, the Forest Gate district school, were as bad as Kate. She was a kind of one on her own. What's surprising is when you then compare this narrative with what you can find out about Frank's life, which is why it's so important that I kind of cracked that pseudonym, which is that, first of all, the experience of his siblings does, in a sense, exacerbate, or both his slightly older brother Henry and his father, their experiences kind of underscore the suffering that he goes through. To see my dad in corduroy, he can't bear the memory of seeing his dad don the corduroy uniform of the workhouse. I mean, we all wear corduroy, but for him, it was the workhouse uniform. He couldn't bear it, and it just made things so much worse. He does, towards the end of his autobiography, talk a little bit about his later career. He talks about being an artist. When you look into his life, you suddenly discover that this is not a man who experiences a life of deprivation. This is a man who moves to Canada and then California. He becomes an artist of some renown in sculpture and portrait medallions. He exhibits at national art expos in the first 20 years of the 20th century. He has considerable commercial and artistic success. So this is a man who, it's nowhere in his autobiography, he mentions his artistic work, but you get no sense of the way in which his life moved in the second half of it. And he ended up in California, and I've got this picture here of Bonnie Bray Street, because he lived in what would now be part of the sort of historic quarter of LA. He didn't just live on the street, he lived in that house, he lived in the White House. So when he wrote to his publishers publishing this book right at the end of his life, that was the address he was using, which gives a really different cast to his story, I think. In a sense, it sharpens it. It puts the story of the district school into even more relief when you understand that he writes about his life in those extremely depressed terms. It wasn't a historic part of LA then. Perhaps it didn't look nearly so nice in 1939, I don't know. But this is a man who achieved considerable success but didn't feel able to talk about it, didn't feel able to write about it. For him, it was much more important that he talked about the way his life was utterly undermined by his time in district school. Against that, we have to place Edward Barn. Now, Barn was a generation younger than Stone. He was born in 1894-5. We think we've got a birth in 1894, but there's a birth certificate in 95, so there's a little bit of uneasiness there already. This was a young man who described the district school as home. He was in a different district school to Frank Stone. He was in the Hanwell School, which is a much larger institution, actually. Forest Gate dealt with about 800 kids. Hanwell dealt with more like 1,200. He describes his earliest memories of being in the workhouse, going from the workhouse to the school, and the school being his family. He refers to one of the teachers as Daddy Wadsworth. He says all the boys called him Daddy Wadsworth. He talks about not so much the curriculum, which probably was fairly dull in terms of the literacy and numeracy skills that they were trying to inculcate, but what these schools did do was they provided quite good facilities for both sports and music. And this was a young man who was very good at cricket, and he learnt the trumpet. And he was very good at both, and he enjoyed them both. In fact, he enjoyed the cricket so much and was so good at it, he was sent out of the school to score for the local cricket team each Saturday. And he refers to the potentially protective function of these schools. In other words, they provide a guardianship when nobody else is doing so. And he does this by explaining how he discovered that he was low status. He said he never had any sense of being a kind of lowly child until he one day went out to score for the local cricket team. And he says, I first became conscious of my lowly status in society, and being a highly sensitive lad, I was never to forget the incident, which I will not describe here, which raises all sorts of interesting questions about what it was, this incident, which occurred that afternoon. The shock of the realization that I was considered to be a member of the lowest form of human creation was an experience from which I have never fully recovered. It affected my nerves and my whole outlook upon life. It affected my confidence and personality, and it left a feeling of deep and profound inferiority, which generally has overshadowed everything I've tried to accomplish over the years. So this is another person who says, this experience has devastated my life. But in his case, it didn't happen in the school, it didn't happen because of the school, it happened because he went out of the school and someone said, right, this was a man in the male changing room at the local cricket team, and I have no idea what it was because he doesn't specify. But clearly it was a profound shock to him. Now, again, partly we might be able to say, well, this experience he underwent was partly owing to, he was able to put his time in school perhaps into some perspective by his later life. He left the school and went into the army as a bandsman. He saw action on the first, well, he was very severely wounded on the first day of Gallipoli. He later in life suffered sort of chronic ill health and kidney disease. So he was able perhaps to put the school into some perspective, given what happens later, how bad things were in the First World War, for example. But the school, he never wavers in his depiction of the school as being a place of protection, something that protected him, a home from which he essentially had to leave. Now, the problem with Edward Barn is when you do that thing that I've suggested that I do, which is that I go and look for people in the historical record, is that there is a notable disjunction between the historical record and Edward Barnes' story. So you have the autobiography, and then you have the experience that you can see he had from the census. So he describes himself as going from the workhouse to the school and never having met his parents, not knowing if he has any siblings. But in the 1901 census, he's not in the school, he's in his uncle's house. So at the age of 5, 6, he's living with a paternal uncle, a man called Charles Barn, with Charles Barnes' wife, Margaret, and their 3 natural children. And he's described there as the adopted son. Now you could say, okay, well, perhaps he forgot. He's only little, he's 5 or 6, perhaps he completely forgot this. But it's also the case that his parents, Edward and Dinah, were still alive. He wasn't an adopted son because his parents were dead. They were both alive. They were living with his 2 brothers in a separate house. Now, this starts to raise all sorts of interesting questions. Why is it that this son, not the youngest, not the eldest, he's the middle surviving son of this couple, why is he in an uncle's house? And does he really not remember anything about it? Or does he blanked it out? What's happened at this uncle's house? What's even more interesting in a way is that in 1903, when his aunt/adoptive mother Margaret dies, he doesn't go back to his parents. He goes immediately to the workhouse and then to the school. Both his parents are still alive. So, in other words, for some reason, this child is isolated from the rest of his family and put in an institution when his birth family are quite extensive. It was when both of the parents die. In fact, his 2 brothers, that he doesn't know about, go to live with a maternal uncle and are brought up by him. So he says in his autobiography, I have no awareness of any relatives. All my relatives have come to me via marriage. But this, again, helps to sharpen his depiction of the school. Whether he knew of his birth family or not, it's the case that he had a large family out there, and apparently to the end of his life he didn't know that he had brothers and sisters. But he had been rejected by his family. Now, he didn't know necessarily the full terms of that, or the reason why, but the school never loses the place of his family in his memoirs. And when you see what has happened in terms of the placing of his siblings, the placing of his parents and him, that becomes that becomes more poignant, more acute. You can see why, if somebody had even the vaguest memory or inkling that they have essentially been dispatched by their birth family to this institution, why you would embrace the only thing which embraces you, which is the school. In other words, the school serves as a kind of guardian for him, where his own family patently do not. Now, I showed you the picture of Bonnie Bray Street, so I had to try and show you the picture of where Edward Barnes ended up. He ended up in Richmond House in Bognor, so he's in one of these flats over this row of shops. He had no regrets about his upbringing, and he had a 32-year career in the civil service and was quite upbeat about it. So a very, very different story to that of Stone. And do we have a reason to prioritise one sort of story over the other? So I'm coming to the end. Workhouses and institutional life was varied, and I have to say that I'm running the gauntlet of my fellow historians here in the sense if there are any in the room, they would immediately jump up and down and say, but what about the periodisation of the poor law? You haven't talked about the way that the workhouse in 1834 might look very different from the workhouse in 1894. And I would say, in answer to that, well, yes, institutional life did vary over the course of these years. But for the people who went in them as children, as far as they were concerned, they were timeless. It'd always been there. They weren't aware of any change. In fact, I've even got one autobiographer who attributes a change that he can see, in other words, where he stops being beaten by the tailor or the shoemaker and starts only being beaten by the schoolmaster. He thinks this is the good offices of the schoolmaster intervening, saying, no, only I can beat this child. Actually, it's a matter of policy. It becomes policy that only schoolmasters are allowed to beat the children in workhouse schools. But he attributes it to the personality of the person he sees in front of him. Because if you're in a workhouse as a child, you're dealing with that schoolmaster, that nurse. You're not concerned about the poor law board. And you not necessarily in there long enough to witness policy change. So I would say that there's a risk for us as historians if we're too wedded to periodisation and saying, well, actually, you can say nothing with these autobiographies because there's one from the 1830s and there's one from the 1890s, and what can you do with that? I would say that you can do something with it because people were not necessarily, they weren't aware of the policy changes they might or might not be subject to, and also policy change could be implemented imperfectly or not at all, as we've seen in relation to Kate, who wasn't supposed to beat anyone but beat everyone, as far as I can gather. And what I think this means is that the Oliver Twist story does tend to both under and over-represent the harshness of these schools. It doesn't anticipate the psychological and lifelong trauma that someone like Frank Stone could suffer, but it also underestimates the extent to which, in a very faulty and flawed welfare system, it could provide guardianship for someone whose family has completely rejected him. So I know that there'll be some genealogists in the room who'll be very happy to hear me say that what I think we need is more family histories, because I think what we need to do is have more people unpack the experience of their their ancestors in their families, but shorn of the easy assumptions that we make about workhouses. It's too easy to say workhouses evil and move on. I think we need to unpick why and how they were so traumatising to understand a bit more the place that they took in these institutions took in Victorian and early 20th century life. Thank you.